morning, everyone, and welcome to the Leadership Institute's August Wednesday Wake Up Club Breakfast. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Deirdre Hackelman. I'm the Director of Events here at the Leadership Institute. Morton's traveling today, so I'll be attempting to fill in his very large Louisiana accented shoes this morning. I encourage you to live tweet today's event, and please use the hashtag WWCB. In 2020, the Leadership Institute has trained 3,995 students in 187 trainings. Since 1979, your Leadership Institute has trained 226,653 students. At the end of this event, you will be redirected to the training schedule on the LI website, and there you'll find all the upcoming trainings that are all online now. And please take a moment to review them and consider attending one or sending a friend to a training. There will be a chance to ask questions at the end of this talk. Please use the Zoom Q&A function there at the bottom of the screen to submit a question should you have one. Now this morning we have with us Kristen Dobson for an update on one of LI's newest initiatives. Kristen Dobson is the Leadership Institute's National Field Director for Campus Leadership Programs. Prior to this, she was the Deputy National Field Director, worked as a Regional Field Coordinator, and a Leadership Institute Field Representative in the great state of Michigan. Kristen graduated from DePaul University and now lives with her husband in Virginia with their beautiful but hyperactive dog, Boston. Go ahead, Kristen.
Thank you, Deirdre. Good morning, everybody. As many of you know, each fall, the campus program sends field representatives out to college campuses all across the country. In light of what's going on currently, colleges are going mostly online, they're restricting access to their campuses, and states are even restricting travel. Because of this, we have decided to adapt by suspending our traditional field rep program and piloting a new campus ambassador program. This new program will harness the strengths unique to college students. Rather than having a field staff member bounce around from campus to campus, from group to group, this program will allow us to train, deputize, and incentivize students to spread the conservative message on their campuses, both in person and online. As the current situation is ever changing, these ambassadors will have firsthand knowledge of their campus's new policies, be able to host events, and even look out for viewpoint discrimination if and when a school allows a left-leaning group to host a speaker or event and not the conservative group. This new program will allow LI to tap into the micro networks that these students have and will help us find and train others like them. Even though we can't make it to campus every day this fall, as like I said, some states are restricting outside residents. We are making sure the conservative message and our network of conservative groups stays alive and remains active. The ambassador program will incentivize students by awarding them points for growing, maintaining, and training their group members, as well as spreading their conservative message to their peers on campus. Whether it be online or in person, we have worked out plans for both, or even hybrid events. These points will be redeemable for swag, gift cards, and even cash. So if you are or you know a college student who wants to be a part of this program, please reach out to me via the website or email me directly at kdobson@leadershipinstitute.org as we are taking applications starting this week. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Kristen. This is just one example of how the Leadership Institute has seamlessly pivoted to different outreach and training strategies during the current virus-related restrictions. And LI does this only through the faithful support of its generous donors. So a huge thank you to all the supporters who are tuning in this morning. I know we've got a few. And again, should you have any questions for Sharyl during her talk, please use the Zoom Q&A function to submit a question, and she may have time to address it at the end. And now to introduce our speaker, we have Natalia Mittelstadt. She is interning with the Leadership Institute in the Office of the President this summer. She is originally from Swedesboro, New Jersey, and graduated this May from Regent University with combined Bachelor of Arts degrees in Communication Studies and Government. After her internship, Natalia hopes to work in political journalism full-time so she can report the news accurately and help keep the public informed. Natalia?
Thank you, Deirdre. Good morning, everyone. To start off, Sharyl Attkisson is a nonpartisan investigative journalist, 5-time Emmy Award winner for reports such as Investigating Congress, Gun Walker, Fast and Furious, TARP, and the Bank Bailout, and a recipient of the Edward R. Murrow Award for investigative reporting. She is author of 2 New York Times bestsellers, The Smear, How Shady Political Operatives and Fake News Control What You See, What You Think, and How You Vote, and Stonewalled. Her upcoming book, Slanted, How the News Media Taught Us to Love Censorship and Hate Journalism, is available for pre-order. She is host and investigative reporter for the Sunday morning national TV news program, Sinclair's Full Measure with Sharyl Attkisson, which focuses on investigative and accountability reporting. For 30 years, Ms. Attkisson was a correspondent and anchor at CBS News, PBS, CNN, and in the local news. Ms. Attkisson is one of the few journalists who have flown in a B-52 on a combat mission over Kosovo and in an F-15 fighter jet combat air patrol flight. She is a 5th degree black belt master in Taekwondo. Previously, Ms. Attkisson hosted a medical news magazine on PBS called Health Week, anchored and reported for CNN, and reported at several local news stations. She's a graduate of the University of Florida School of Journalism and Communications. Please welcome Sharyl Attkisson.
Hi, everybody. Thank you so much. Thank you for the nice introduction. And I will assume I can be heard. It's kind of weird to speak to the computer and not really know feedback-wise if everything's going okay. But I'm going to assume everybody can hear me. Someone will let me know if not. Thank you for having me come here. You know, during the introduction, they talked about me working at CNN. It really makes me think how much has changed. I was there when CNN was a news organization, a real news organization in the 1990 timeframe, and it's changed so much. And that is a whole chapter in my new book, Slanted. And I think one thing I was able to do that really sheds a lot of light on what's happened in the news is I talked to current and former CNN insiders, as well as current and former executives and reporters from the New York Times, from ABC, NBC, MSNBC, virtually every big broadcast organization, news division presidents. And they spoke to me really candidly about what I call the devolution of the news as we once knew it. And I'm assuming a lot of you are fairly young and may not remember a time, sort of the time I was educated during maybe mid-1980s, when we were taught, at least I was taught at the University of Florida, that news was sort of a straight thing where you do your reporting, you present various sides and viewpoints and facts, but you don't put your own opinion in the hard news story. You don't tell people what you think because who cares? And you're usually not an expert on the topic anyway. You're getting information and expertise from others. But maybe all you know today, if you're pretty young, is this news environment we have today where that's all changed. And it's really only changed relatively quickly in the last few years. I would say the big start of this was about the 2015-16 timeframe, this election, the election cycle. And this is a new thing to so many of us who have been into journalism for decades, because this is not how we were taught things work. You watch the New York Times today, or you read the paper, there was a time when they would not have blended the reporter's opinion as if it's a fact, unattributed in a hard news piece on the front page. And they do it all the time now. The reporters at the Times write articles pretending to know the mind, sort of like a novel, to be inside the mind of the person they're reporting on or criticizing. For example, Donald Trump. There are articles that say what he was thinking and what he was doing when he was alone in a room one night. Of course, they don't have any information as to whether that could be true or not. They're just going by, I guess, what somebody told them, not attributing it. Again, this is the stuff that may have been written in novels or opinion pieces of just a few years back that's now passing itself off as hard news. This is a huge shift and a huge change. And there's a very powerful industry driving it, an industry made up of politicians and politicos and corporations and PR firms and nonprofits and LLCs and blogs and super PACs that all work together to control narratives, control information, control the news. And one big reason I think why we're seeing the news so compromised today, for a long time, since at least 2000, when I've been studying this phenomenon and realizing what was going on, there were many powerful forces working to influence the news, but now they are the news. We have invited them into our newsrooms, these political operatives and corporate interests. They work as reporters and editors. We're one and the same. This is something that wouldn't have happened, again, just maybe 10 years ago, because at least to the degree it is today, we try to have at least the appearance of somewhat of a firewall between our news reporters and the special interests, but now it's all blended together. And I think that explains why, when there are so many, as I call them, media mistakes, the likes of which I've never seen before since about 2016, with New York Times, Washington Post, the major networks, CNN, making so many factual errors and mistakes in their reporting. And there was a time when if you made one big mistake like that, you probably would be risking your job. But now, over and over again, the same people and the same companies and the same news outlets are making the same really big journalism mistakes that shouldn't be made even in journalism school. You learn these things, some of these remedial errors you learn not to do your first year. And then there's oftentimes little repercussion. And I think that's because it's mission accomplished. The people working in the newsrooms in many cases are equal to political or corporate operatives. So they're not punished when they get something wrong. They accomplished their goal. They got out a narrative, even if it had to be corrected later, because they know that most people won't see the correction. They'll see the original news narrative. So I thought I would answer a couple questions that I ask myself, because these are commonly asked, before I take some from you guys. But the first one is, and I've spoken about this in a TEDx talk that I did. If you're interested in hearing more, you could just Google Attkisson and TEDx, or you could Google probably what is fake news, or is fake news real? And in there I define, or I talk about what is fake news, because a lot of people, when I go speak and I ask who they think invented the phrase in its modern context, it's been used for a long time, but in the past couple of years, most people think Donald Trump came up with the phrase and popularized it. And what they don't know, as I traced in my book, The Smear, this is a phrase that was really put on the forefront by a nonprofit called First Draft, which was started at the beginning of the 2015 election cycle. This fake news phrase and the notion that somebody had to step in and tell us what was real and what was not, that's a relatively new concept in terms of how we're using it today. And about the time First Draft started, and I only know this in retrospect because I didn't know at the time there was a nonprofit called First Draft, but shortly after that, I think it was September 2016, President Obama gave a speech at Carnegie Mellon in which he said somebody would need to step in and curate information in this wild, wild west media environment. And I remember at the time hearing that speech and thinking, what's he talking about? Because again, if you're fairly young, you may not know that this is a relatively new concept, that some third party should come in and get between us and our information and curate it for us and tell us what's real and filter it and fact check it. That's all. Nobody was clamoring for that. At least the average citizen had not raised that. It was not considered a problem. Nobody was talking about it. But as soon as President Obama put this on the public stage, this notion, and First Draft was in the background also about the same time talking about fake news, almost on a daily basis from that moment on, you can check. And it was fake news, supposed fake news was making headlines in the New York Times and the Washington Post, and they were flagging all the fake news. And in every case, at least if you looked at First Draft's website at the time, the fake news they were flagging was always conservative fake news. There was no liberal fake news in their view. So it made me sort of think, is there a special interest behind this, as there often is? And their definition of fake news was more or less, it's come to be, it's all-encompassing, just things that people don't like or opinions they disagree with. But in the beginning, they were flagging primarily totally fake conservative websites that would make completely false claims, such as the Pope had endorsed Bernie Sanders or something that hadn't happened. And then it came to be where that definition was, used and broadened a little bit by people in the news. They started talking about, again, stuff that maybe they differed or disagreed with as fake news. And then the conservatives came up with their own punchback, and Donald Trump led the way. He started calling them fake news. And his definition, or the conservative definition of fake news, came to be more mainstream media outlets that were misreporting or getting their facts wrong or showing bias in their stories, and that was their definition of fake news. So the left had its definition, the right had its definition. But I would have to say, Donald Trump, being the master marketer, he would go to the rallies, as you know, and every time point to the fake news. It became sort of his rallying cry. And pretty soon, because he was so successful at what I call a hostile takeover of the phrase fake news, the people who started it were kind of like begging everybody not to use that term anymore, because I think he had been very successful at co-opting it. In fact, in January of 2017, I think the Washington Post wrote an article and said it's time to retire the term fake news. And they had been using it, but they didn't like how it was being turned and twisted around. I go through all that to say that I went and researched who started First Draft, this nonprofit, because these things don't happen by accident. This movement where right before the election, President Obama comes out and says our information has to be curated, when nobody had in the public had really been clamoring for any such thing. Why did First Draft come on the scene? And sure enough, First Draft, it turns out, was started at the beginning of the election cycle by, can you guess? It was funded by Google. And Google's parent company, Alphabet, was run by a big Democrat supporter, Hillary Clinton guy named Eric Schmidt, who I think was a top donor to Bernie Sanders, a top donor to Hillary Clinton, volunteered for her campaign. So this is the money backing this effort to go after supposed fake news, in their view, all conservative. And it starts to look like many things do to me when you dig into them, an effort to shape public opinion, not a true effort to get to the fact of the matter. And that's really the problem behind, as I see it, most of the curation and the media literacy and the fact check efforts that we see today, is that these are not neutral parties that are funding them or backing them. And if you're like me and you've watched and read a lot of these efforts and the fact checks and these entities that claim to be the neutral arbiters, they almost always come down on one side of things. You start to know, as an impartial observer or just as a news consumer, wow, they're always going to say, coming around to some way, that this side, that's the progressive side, as I usually find, or a certain corporate interest, they're going to always say that the side that doesn't agree with their worldview is partly false or fake or not true or something, but it's hardly ever cuts the other way. And I'm talking about issues of certain medical issues, when there's pharmaceutical industry backing behind a certain narrative they don't want you to think. I'm talking about hot button issues where there's a lot of debate and scientific debate and varying opinions, where they apparently don't want you to think there is. Climate change, how to handle racial issues, abortion. I mean, many things on which there's dispute. These fact checkers and curators of information will come down on one side. So I think there's an inherent problem, and we should be concerned with those who try to get between us and our information, especially when they present themselves as neutral, because too often they're not. I published an article yesterday, if you want to look at it, at Real Clear Investigations. And I think the website's realclearinvestigations.com. And I looked into the Facebook Oversight Committee's ties, because Facebook, because it's been criticized, as you may know, for the censorship of certain ideas and people and so on, appointed a board of 20 people, I think there's going to be 40 ultimately, to independently, you could appeal to them and they'll check the facts and they'll check what should and shouldn't be removed. And I found that 18 of 20 of them have ties to the progressive philanthropist and activist George Soros or his Open Society foundations. 18 of 20. And this was widely heralded in the media and by Facebook as a diverse group of these experts who would be doing this work to make sure Facebook was being fair. And in fact, they're not very diverse at all when you look at their worldview, their politics, and their connections to certain sources of funding. There's nobody on there that I could find who had published or been activists on one side of an issue, but they had almost all been activists on the other side of these certain issues, and almost always progressive. So, when they're fact checking these activists and advocates, which I think is not a good idea for someone who's determining what's fair to remove or to keep up. I'm not sure they should be activists and advocates, left or right. They should be maybe neutral free speech parties. But anyway, when you're going to pull from a pool of activists and advocates, as Facebook says, all of them experienced in human rights, well, you're going to get a fact check or a result that comes down a certain way. And I find this is the case really with so many of these media curating efforts where our information is being steered. Google, as you probably know, steers our search results in a certain direction, again, where the pharmaceutical industry may want them to steer it, where other interests, I know members of Congress have called Google and the high-tech companies and gotten them to make certain censorship moves. I don't think an individual member of Congress should have the power. We certainly didn't elect them, or I don't think they have the authority to do it, but they take it to contact a big social media company like Facebook or Twitter and tell them to take down certain stories or ideas or to censor certain things. But that's exactly what's happening now. And I think it's a very dangerous time in terms of our information and control of it. So what is fake news? Kind of in the eye of the beholder, but I think it was an effort and has grown into an effort to control our information, not to really stop fake news. Why are there so many fact checks that fall down and media curation efforts on the left side or on certain corporate interest sides versus right? I will say, in fairness, I think corporations of all kinds would like to control the news content that we have and news narratives. I think political activists and figures on left and right would like to control what we see on the news and what we read on social media. But I think it's hard not to notice that the left has been more effective at it. Not that the right hasn't tried and doesn't have its own efforts to do it, but the left has been more effective, partly because I think it is more embraced by the media at large. What do I mean by that? Well, let's look at Media Research Center on the right and Media Matters for America, the smear left group headed by David Brock. I did some research. Media Research Center does a lot of media criticism when they think the media has been biased and unfair. Media Matters actually does more. They're just a huge organization of network of nonprofits and LLCs and super PACs that all get together to boycott and do a lot of really social activism, but they are treated often by the press as if there's some sort of neutral arbiter of facts. A lot of times the press refers to their research, which is conflicted, and they certainly have a lot of false and misleading information, but they're quoted as if there's some authority, as if Media Matters is a neutral authority. And I've even talked to reporters who don't know the history of what it's about and who it supports and how it was started, and they thought, because they don't do their homework, it's a neutral group. So I think because so many times the left views are presented and embraced by the media at large as if it's a legitimate view, whereas the conservative counterparts are not treated that way, it's why the left seems so much more successful when they're trying to control the narratives. I want to mention media literacy because that's an outgrowth of fake news. When people didn't want to use that phrase anymore because they thought that maybe Donald Trump had co-opted it, it became, well, we're going to have to teach people how to learn what's fake news through media literacy efforts. And a lot of these same groups, such as First Draft, lead these media literacy efforts, which again, I think is too often, not always, but too often code for we'll tell you what to think and we're going to aim you to the same sources we want you to believe and steer you from the information we don't want you to hear about. And this is very dangerous in my view because these groups, under this patina of legitimacy and fairness and that they have the answer to what we should all be looking at in terms of news and information, they're partnering with academic institutions such as Harvard and major universities. They're helping with groups that write laws in states that are passing that certain things be taught in public schools as young as elementary school about what children should be taught they can believe and not believe. And too often, again, it's not a critical thinking agenda. It's steering them towards certain news sources. And who's backing some of these bills? Well, again, they're members of Congress with ties to pharmaceutical interests. And I keep bringing them up because they very much control a lot of our agenda today in many respects as to what we can find online and what the news will report. And they're backing certain people by giving contributions to certain members of the legislature in a state who then propose bills to curate information a certain way and teach media literacy in schools to steer the kids away from some information and toward other information. So I think media literacy efforts, you really have to dig deep. It sounds good. Fact checking sounds good. Going after fake news sounds good. But unfortunately, every time I think we invite third parties in to help us decide what's news or what's real, we're inviting or we're opening ourselves up to the possibility that we're going to be shaped and the information is going to be censored instead of opened up to us. Social media searches. Oh, I wanted to use the example of how a narrative, we're kind of subject to narratives, even people on the news who work in the news who don't know it or don't even mean to be. And you have to think just one step deeper than maybe you think of. Like you may watch the news and say, I know I'm getting just a news narrative that somebody wants me to think because they're all talking about the same thing, using the same language, using the same phrases. But you have to go even a step further. And the example I wanted to use, and I did a podcast talking about this, was police reform. So in the wake of all of this violence and the problems over policing, I would say almost every station I've listened to has reporters who will say something like, reporters and analysts, well, we all know policing needs to be reformed, but not so sure about defunding. But they start with the caveat, well, we all agree police should be reformed. And I'm thinking about that just as an analytical thinker. Well, who knows that? These reporters and analysts who are saying it, I don't think have studied police agencies across the country. What are the issues? What does police reform mean? What are you even talking about? Reform what? I doubt they're experts in it, but they have accepted the narrative, even as they think they're bucking it by saying, well, we don't need to defund the police, by agreeing that the police somehow at large must be reformed, by saying those words without really knowing any information about it. They've fallen victim to the narrative. They've already agreed and accepted a little piece of the narrative unquestioningly. And as a reporter, when I was first working in the business, I covered a lot of different police departments and problems on police agencies. And I learned a lot about what some were doing wrong and the accreditation process and the responsibility of police to take people into custody peacefully if possible, even if they're justified in using violence. The trick is to try not to have to use violence, even if you're allowed to based on what the suspect's doing. You want to take someone into custody without hurting them. I learned a lot about good policing, bad policing. I've covered agencies where it's been done well. I've covered agencies where it's been done poorly. But I think in fairness, based on what I know, and I probably know a little more than a lot of reporters talking about this, I think it's an overgeneralization to make this statement, we all know policing needs reforming. I'm not even sure what that means or what they mean when they say that, but I don't think there's any evidence that at large, and it may be the case, I'm just saying there's no evidence that all police agencies or the police industry needs reforming. We have quite a good record compared to most countries when it comes to policing. There are some departments that have stellar records that I wouldn't say need much, if any, reform at all. Maybe they don't. Maybe they have a lot they could teach other agencies. On the other hand, I've worked and covered police agencies that have big problems. So again, beware when you hear people say things like, we all know, we all agree policing needs reform. If you don't know it, maybe they don't know it. Use your common sense and think, why are they saying that? Who wants us to think that and why? I guess that's sort of the biggest question I ask myself when I watch the news or I see narratives repeated on news and social media, or they want to squelch certain viewpoints and not have you hear them or find them. I'm always thinking, who wants me to believe that and why? What they're pushing out there. I worry that we've sort of exited the golden age of information that started with the advent of the internet, but seems to be drawing to a close if we don't do something about it, whereby we used to be able to get pretty much most information that's publicly accessible without a lot of filtering on the internet. But now we're seeing so many efforts to filter and curate and fact check and rule out and controversialize and pull down accounts and deplatform and cancel. You know, I'm afraid that your kids, or even when you get older, you won't even hardly remember a time when information was readily accessible on the internet, free from the bias of those who want to steer us in a certain direction. So that's one of my biggest concerns today. Last point, and then I will take some questions if you have any. The government has stepped in to say maybe it needs to do something about the unfair nature of what's going on in social media, censorship and that sort of thing. Democrats, many of them actually think more information should be censored or taken down because they think not enough is being pulled down, and they're criticizing big tech companies for that. Republicans tend to say too much information is being taken down and they're being specifically targeted. I just worry that when the government steps in, I'm not sure that's the answer either, because again, you're inviting a third party, and believe me, every member up on Capitol Hill, they collect contributions from industries and different organizations. They have their own interests. Every time you invite a third party to get in the way of you and your information, I think it's just another chance for somebody to apply censorship. When I talk about censorship of big tech companies, you may say to yourself, well, censorship is only when the government does it. But I'm arguing in my new book, Slanted, that I think the definition of censorship I now use in a different way to apply to what the big tech companies are doing, because they are inextricably tied to government and the decisions they make now. Maybe they feel they have to kowtow to what a Democrat or Republican says they should do, or risk being regulated or having new laws passed against them. So I think it's all tied so closely together that I talk about what the big tech companies do now in terms of censorship, even though it is not directly done by the hand of government. All right, so that's sort of my biggest interest today, what I talk about, what my new book's about. Do you guys have any questions you'd like to ask?
All right, we've got lots of questions for you, Sharyl.
Okay.
And I want to thank you again for coming on. I think you and I have been playing email tag for over 2 years now.
Yes.
So excited to have you. And it's kind of fortuitous or not, depending on how you look at it, that a lot of your past investigations have really aligned with some of the current events that are affecting us right now. So,
yeah.
And then the questions reflect that. So let's dive in. First question, they want to know your thoughts on the recent MSNBC employee, their public resignation, and her Twitter thesis that MSM has cancer. How do you think we can change the model of news so we can go back to what journalism used to be? She seems to think that the quote unquote industry model of news is why we are now polarized. So how can we change this?
Well, I'll let you know I've been traveling on the road, so I've listened to a bit of the radio. I haven't watched any news for almost 9 days, or hardly any news, but I did hear some reporting on that. And based on what I heard, I agree with her. That's why I left CBS ahead of my contract. That's why this New York Times reporter, who is actually a progressive liberal, claims she quit, not long ago. It's happening all over the industry. We all see it, but most people can't walk away from their job. They have bills to pay and kids to feed, and they like what they do, or they want to keep doing journalism. And where are you going to go if you walk away from the New York Times or the Washington Post or a network? But I don't know how you fix the model. I agree with whether you're a journalist who sits left, right, or nonpartisan. A lot of them do try to be independent. You're disgusted by the turn that news has taken, by the things that your bosses and the corporation makes you do, or the things you see your colleagues are allowed to do that fly in the face of good journalism. And, I talk a lot of people who confided in me about that in the book Slanted, that couldn't really go by name, but have noticed the same thing I noticed, and that this MSNBC producer apparently noticed. I don't know how you change the model, because I think this would have had to have been addressed on the front end. I'm talking about the year 2000. I went to the attorneys at CBS when my reporting would be attacked in an organized way by these special interests who felt they were hurt by it. Maybe certain corporations would hire companies to start harassing CBS before the story aired, to take to social media with a campaign before and after to controversialize the reporter. All of these tactics that I saw, I remember saying to the lawyers at CBS who I would have approve my investigative stories, we need to do something. These are well-funded, multi-million dollar, in some cases multi-billion dollar corporations hired to, and law firms, to harass us and shape us and stop us from reporting certain things. We're playing defense. We need to have some sort of plan where we're not just playing defense after the fact. We have to recognize this and fight it so that we can remain independent. And the truth is, news people are not good at that. They just go in every day and try to do their news job. They're not good at figuring out how to fight multinational PR corporations that are trying to shape the news, and we didn't. And now here we find ourselves in a position where it's so entrenched in the newsrooms, I don't know how you get it out. Now the people that run the newsrooms, too many of the reporters and analysts in the newsrooms, they all work for these causes, corporate and political interests. And to think you can extricate them somehow neatly, first of all, you'd have to have these companies agree there's a problem, and they don't agree there's a problem. So I think maybe I hear a lot of journalists talk about trying to start news organizations in addition to what we have that people are still thirsty for, that cover more news down the middle, more like they perceive it ought to be done or used to be done. Maybe those will gain traction as those efforts try. On Full Measure, my Sunday TV show, we do that every day. I mean, I may have a Democrat on there and listen to, without arguing, I will ask some critical questions and hear their views and let them answer, which is not done on TV much, these days. And also have a conservative on later that do the same thing. Most of my reporting is non-political, but I'm certainly hearing from all different views and different sides on facts and underreported stories against the narrative. But I think we need more news outlets that are still willing to do that, and too many of them just don't. That's not on their agenda. And I don't know how we get out of that. I feel like we're 20 years too late if we really wanted to turn that ship.
Yeah, no, a lot of the questions that are coming in, you kind of answered a bunch of different ones, some being that a lot of people have noticed this trend before the 2015-2016 cycle, like you just mentioned. And then a lot of people wondering what to do about the model, which you've now addressed.
Well, I always say, call it out for what it is. I mean, I read these ridiculous, sometimes fact-checked findings where they'll take a piece of true information that they don't like, and they'll end up rating it mostly false by giving it some kind of context, that they want you to have. Call them on it. Like, we at home don't have to say we believe this stuff. We at home don't have to look at Twitter, which is, often manipulated. I've written about that too. There's software that these corporations use and political interests use to create the appearance that everybody thinks something, and they can generate a lot of social media, and then it takes on a life of its own. And you're at home going, I don't feel that way, but I guess I'm the only one who doesn't feel that way. No, you're not. Like, don't buy into it. I tell younger people, don't live in the box. This box is an artificial reality, especially news and social media, that doesn't reflect many times what's going on in this country, what people are thinking, and what's real. So don't buy into it, and don't feel like you have to. So I just say, call it for what it is when you see it, and stand up for yourself.
Great. So next question, they want to know more about your exit from CBS. So what prompted you to take a stand, likely knowing at CBS you may complicate your life and career or possibly lose your job?
Well, I didn't lose my job, I quit. But I wrote 2 books. This is a long story and I won't tell it because it could probably get boring. But I saw this coming, this trend. And when you do investigative reporting, and there are so many efforts to manage what you report from politicians and corporate interests, it got to the point with CBS having some people working there, not in the earlier years I was there, but toward the end, and I quit in 2014 ahead of my contract. It got to be where I could see that I wasn't going to be doing what I thought was meaningful reporting. And when you get to be my age, maybe if I was 25, I would have continued to figure out how to survive. But I adapted every way I could just to try to do meaningful investigative reporting. I didn't even look at politics, but it didn't matter what you did. They just didn't want stuff that was perceived to go after anybody, whistleblowers, corporations, any political interests. And I saw the writing on the wall. I did everything I could over a period of, I actually quit twice. They convinced me to stay one extra year when I quit the first time. I walked out, packed up my office, and left one day, having planned to do that for about 6 weeks. I got my stuff together, talked to my husband and my family, said I was going to quit my job. I quit and just said they can't, even though I'm mid-contract, they can't make me come in. I'm not a slave. And if I don't come in, ultimately they'll fire me, I hope, and then we're done. Well, it didn't work out so easily, and we had some conversations, and they said they knew there were issues, and they convinced me to stay. I stayed one more year. I got 3 more Emmy nominations. That was probably one of my best years reporting-wise ever, but they also squelched a lot of stories, and I could see, again, it was just not going to be a happy situation for me. And so about a year after that, maybe a little less, I went ahead and resigned, and we actually parted fairly amicably. And I never told them it was because of liberal bias, which you see reported in the press all the time about me. Again, fake news. I never gave that reason. It was a complex list of things that had to do with the direction the industry was going, the things we're talking about today, that I didn't think was really much different at any of the other networks based on my friends' experiences. And I just thought it was not the thing for me to do. The Sunday TV show I do now is an independent show where the head of the company promised complete independence and has delivered on it. I've never had so much independence. This is a conservative ownership here. I've worked for 3 very liberal ownership or managers, Democrat donor billionaires. This place, working for the conservative for whatever reason, has been the place where I've had the least, meaning zero interference in terms of what topics we can report, what we have to say, sort of like censoring and editing things. So it's been a wonderful add-on to my career that I didn't expect to have, that this show was offered that I could do. And so we're going into season 6 of Full Measure in September.
That's great to hear. We do have a few questions that have touched on, in light of everything that you've said and verifying, I think, a lot of our listeners' experiences. How do you recommend going about gathering some accurate news and figuring out what is true and what isn't?
I think your best bet is because I don't have a single resource I can refer you to. Your best bet today is to take all news with a grain of salt. It doesn't mean that what you're seeing is not true, but I never believe anything I see at face value without further verification. How many times, and I would tell you almost every time, some outrageous video is reported on where we think we know the whole story, and you think there couldn't be any other context that changes what you think you know about the video. Again, journalism 101, you're not supposed to report like that, but we do all the time now. Oh, look what happened. This is, you as the viewer should think the same. When you see something reported, no matter how many people are saying it, no matter how many anonymous or on-the-record sources are confirming it, no matter what news organization's doing it, say to yourself, who wants me to think this and why? And realize that before you buy into whatever it is, you should probably give it some time and maybe try to do some of your own work, which is hard. I mean, that's what the news was supposed to do. Who has time to do their own research on a news story through all these different interests that we're talking about to figure out what's true? We used to do that, or that was our job, but it's not being done today. What do? I look for the original source as often as I can, and C-SPAN is a great way. If you see a quote from somebody, a soundbite, and it sounds so outrageous and somebody's telling you what somebody said, I can usually find an original source. And almost every time when I watch the whole thing, I have a whole different takeaway. At least my view of what was said is different than what's being presented on the news or clips on social media. So just keep that in mind. C-SPAN's a great place to look at, original hearings, original press conferences. There's other places you can find longer clips of sound bites. How many sound bites and clips have been taken out of context? That the media, again, this is egregious. I've listed some of these errors on my website, SharylAttkisson.com. Media mistakes in the era of Trump. You have reporters that reported Donald Trump was fake listening to a foreign leader at some, maybe it was a United Nations thing, where all the other foreign leaders had these big headphones on. And so you get to Trump and he's nodding and looking at paper, but he doesn't have the big headsets on. So the press, uncritically, without checking their facts, reports, look, he's fake listening. He's not wearing his headsets. How stupid is he? Well, Trump was wearing his earpiece here. He doesn't wear the big headsets. And only after the fact, when the White House saw the false report and corrected it, Well, by that time, that had gone all around the world, that little clip that looked like Trump was fake listening. You know, there's been reports saying that a dignitary, I think it was a first lady somewhere, you know, wouldn't shake Trump's hand, but if you looked at the whole video, she had shaken his hand. And yet the reporters took that little clip and didn't look at the whole thing. There have been quotes recently, as you know, taken out of context on Sunday talk shows when the whole quote showed something far different. There was a quote used by the press that Donald Trump said, didn't know that Japan already makes cars in the US in a speech that he gave. But if you heard the whole quote, he had just said he knows Japan makes cars in the US, but they took a piece of a quote that made it sound like he didn't. Do you remember the goldfish dumping? I think it was in Japan shortly after Trump became president. CNN and others showed a little clip of Trump just dumping all the fish food in this fish thing with the emperor of Japan or somebody, as if he were impetuous and impatient. But if you looked at the whole clip, the head of Japan had done the same thing first, and Trump followed suit, which diplomatically is what you're taught to do when you're a foreign country. You follow the lead of your host. You know, that's proper diplomacy. But so I don't know, there's just so many examples like that. You need to keep in mind that what you're seeing or what you're being shown, who wants me to think that and why? And before you buy into it, have a healthy dose of skepticism and maybe do some of your own checking.
Great.
Great.
Well, launching into some of the current affairs issues, we had a few questions about hydroxychloroquine. Can you just summarize some of your investigations into it? Because I know I've been reading up on you and making sure what we could talk about, and it sounds like you've done some of your own research there. Can you kind of highlight some of the stuff you found that was interesting and relevant?
Well, as usual, I'm looking for narratives and media coverage why we're seeing something. Hydroxychloroquine I knew nothing about, but of course what I noticed was the moment Trump said something about it, there were these overt attacks by members of the media who surely don't know themselves the science of, nor do I, this particular drug, but were accusing the president of killing people. You know the whole thing. So I'm like, okay, who's against hydroxychloroquine? Why can't we hear this view? Why do people want the view censored? Why are you taken down from social media? I mean, this is stuff that I don't think should be allowed, that pulling down because a scientific view is a certain way, or because you have an opinion, or because you're looking for research. And so I ended up wanting to report this underreported view about hydroxychloroquine. What is the fact? What is the truth? And what I learned was, talking to a lot of scientists, and I got some of them on the record for my story for Full Measure, it had not been ruled out at the time where people reporting was killing people. I heard someone on TV actually say that, or an anchor say, this drug will kill you. And I know enough about medicine, I've covered a lot of it, to know that the FDA is not allowed to, I mean, rarely it happens for periods of time, but in general, the FDA can't leave a drug on the market that's a killer drug. It's just, this drug's been on the market for decades, is considered safe and effective by the FDA. So why, does it suddenly know if you take it for hydroxychloroquine, is it a smart drug that kills you when it knows you're taking it for coronavirus, but it doesn't kill you when it knows you're taking it for malaria? Like, that doesn't make sense. So it turns out, what I know is the drug has not been ruled out. It is not considered deadly by those who prescribe it regularly. They think it's a very safe drug in general. And I spoke to the clinicians who do it. The clinicians who prescribe it think that those who are speaking against it, who don't prescribe it, sort of policy people or academics that don't have clinical practice, that they don't know what they're talking about. Now, on the other side, the people who think it's dangerous have looked at some specific studies and findings. In some cases, they're not peer-reviewed published studies, but somebody was putting out information to make the medicine, in some cases, I think, to make it appear dangerous. And I think 3 of those studies have been retracted that made hydroxychloroquine look dangerous. So all I can tell you now is there's something like 600 studies going on of different drugs and treatments and therapies. And we don't know as reporters, and we shouldn't be telling you that we somehow have divined which drugs are going to work and which drugs are good. We should be reporting on various possible treatments and preventives and vaccines and so on in a fair way, and reporting what scientists say on both sides. Yes, if some think it's dangerous, and yes, if some think it's not. And that's what I tried to do with my hydroxychloroquine piece. But I also, in addition to reporting that it's not been ruled out as a preventive or as a treatment, and that some consider it very promising, I also follow the money because that can answer a lot of questions. When I follow the money as to who's behind maybe some of the skepticism about hydroxychloroquine, which is a very cheap drug that nobody's going to make a lot of money on because it's generic, it's been around so long, maybe 10, 15 cents a pill. Well, you look at remdesivir, which in contrast got this warm reception. This is a drug that's never been approved for any use in the United States. It was invented for Ebola, but never used because there were better drugs for Ebola, but it's been sitting around. And it's an IV drug you take when you're very sick in the hospital as opposed to the cheap pill. But once you get in the hospital, if remdesivir works, it's perhaps thousands of dollars, per course of treatment. So these are two very different drugs. Why is everybody so high on remdesivir, which is also unproven, but being considered as a possible promising treatment? And I looked at the FDA board that's advising on this. And I can't remember the numbers now, but this was in my story. About half the board had taken money or had a relationship with the maker of remdesivir. And none of them disclosed having worked for makers of hydroxychloroquine. So what a coincidence that of all the drug makers in the world, and there are so many, that half of this board chosen to litigate on hydroxychloroquine and remdesivir happen to have ties to remdesivir's drug maker and not hydroxychloroquine. Could that be responsible in part for this, more negative view of hydroxychloroquine? I can't say. You can use your own judgment, but I think reporting that context helps you understand what could be at play here.
Yeah, no, thank you for that. Kind of piggybacking on some health topics here, I wanted to go into your investigations into the vaccination industry a little bit, since you touched on pharmaceutical companies and everyone they work with. And we're now, hearing rumors about the Bill Gates Foundation and some of his motivations and plans for the future. Can you talk a little bit about your investigations? What surprised you? What you think is relevant to something like that happening now, and what we should be looking out for as concerns as private citizens?
Well, when I was assigned to look into vaccines initially at CBS News, maybe around 2001, affiliated with the 9/11 attacks and the thought that we were going to restart smallpox vaccination, which we ended up not doing because it was deemed too dangerous, the vaccination versus the risk. I knew nothing of this. And boy, going down a rabbit hole. I'm fully vaccinated, my kid's fully vaccinated. All this talk about vaccine safety stuff, I like to think I'm a critical thinker, but it all sounded crazy to me. You hear about autism, and long story short, I spent a full year before I reported on vaccines and autism, making sure I understood, and never talked to advocates. I only talked to the peer-reviewed published papers and the research, and came to understand, and now I can tell you unequivocally, that there are many scientists who believe vaccines are linked to autism. The government has acknowledged that vaccines trigger autism. It's a question of how often and in what kind of kids. The government's own pro-vaccine expert, who serves as an expert witness in court, I did a big story with him because he signed an affidavit, and I think I'm the only one that reported this, that said he used to think vaccines couldn't cause autism, and he would testify to that in court. He then realized, based on science and his own patient experience, that vaccines do cause autism in rare cases, in his view. In exceptional cases, he calls them with kids that have pre-existing conditions that get triggered by the immune load or whatever it is that happens when you get vaccinated. And he says he told the government this many years ago, and that the Department of Justice, which defends, believe it or not, against the vaccine victims in court. There's billions of dollars have been paid to vaccine victims, but the government fights the patients on behalf of the vaccine makers through an arrangement made. So anyway, this pro-vaccine, world-renowned pediatric neurologist who was working for the government defending vaccines came around and said, well, they do sometimes cause autism, so don't misrepresent my views in court, he's telling the government, according to his affidavit. And Department of Justice, again, according to a sworn affidavit, went back to court and did the opposite of what he said. They fired him as an expert witness and misrepresented his opinion in court, and continue to this day. If you ask them the question, unless you know how to ask it, they will still say vaccines don't cause autism, and that's debunked. But if you ask the question in the right way, they acknowledge that that's the case, that it's happened, and that research still, they'll say, needs to be done, although nobody's doing it because they're trying to steer it in the other direction. What do you need to know about vaccines? I would say in general, if I had to look back based on what I know, I would still have vaccinated my daughter very much the same way I did. So it's not as though the things I've learned have made me factually turn away from the idea of vaccination. I think that there are many good things, that can come with vaccination. The problem is the narrative, the pharmaceutical interests, both Democrats and Republicans are bought out in some respects by this industry. They'll say stuff like, to get you from discussing any vaccine safety issues, you're anti-vaccine if you discuss a vaccine safety issue. Well, I'm no more anti-vaccine than I'm anti-tire when I did stories about the bad Ford Firestone tire rollovers. Most tires are safe. The ones that aren't should be studied and pulled from the market. Medicine's like that. Vaccines are like that. So anybody who tells you all vaccines are good, or all vaccines are equal, or all vaccines are equally necessary and equally tolerated by all people, that's just false. I think it's a nuanced picture. Most scientists will tell you that some are better than others, some work differently in other people. Some people have predisposed conditions that make them react badly to vaccines. That's on the label. CDC agrees with that. The trick is figuring out which people, which conditions, and there's too many factors that try to keep us from going in that direction because the pharmaceutical industry is so afraid if we look at vaccine safety that way, they'll lose business. People will stop vaccinating with the vaccines they need, and billions of dollars will go down the drain, and then they make the public argument that infectious diseases would make a resurgence. I don't agree. I think if, as one public health service person said in an internal email, if the government and pharmaceutical industry came clean with the public on these risks, particularly vaccines and autism, there would be a buy-in. The public would then understand, they could believe what the government's saying. Right now, there's so much distrust because they know they're not getting full and complete truthful information at all times. But if the government would actually be more forthright about these things and about vaccine safety, I think they could improve the vaccine program, make vaccines safer, and make more people vaccinated in a safer way.
Great, thank you for that. We've got about 50 unanswered questions, just to give you an example
Wow.
of how
I'm
much.
sorry my answers have been so long. That's irritating.
No. Beautiful. So I tried to kind of package them all into as much as we could here, but I want to be respectful of your time, and we're just about up here. So thank you again so much for joining us. This was very comprehensive, and I think we all learned so much from your years and years of investigative and ethical journalism. So thank you so much for being here.
Well, thank you for having me. And if you want to, I don't know if there's a way to save the questions. If you want to send them and there's any way I can give them back to you with a couple of answers, I'm happy to do that in the next few days if anybody's interested.
Yeah, I can send a follow-up email to all the attendees, and maybe I'll shoot you some questions that have been packaged up, and we can give kind of a second follow-up, if you will.
Okay. Thank you, everybody.
Great. And it's tradition for all of our Wednesday Wake Up Club speakers to receive an Adam Smith tie or scarf. So Sharyl, keep an eye out in the mail for your scarf.
Thank you. All right.
For our guests today, please join us on September 2 for our next virtual Wednesday Wake Up Club breakfast with Kellyanne Conway. I encourage you to RSVP online at leadershipinstitute.org/breakfast. Thank you all for joining us online this morning. Until next time, stay well.
Thanks so much for watching this video. To watch our latest video, click here. And to make sure you don't miss any future videos, be sure to subscribe.